It was late on a Thursday evening when the traffic light at the intersection of Elm and Park Avenue turned red, its glow piercing through the otherwise quiet night. The streets were unusually empty, save for the few scattered headlights of cars in the distance and the occasional pedestrian strolling along the sidewalks, disappearing into the shadows cast by the streetlights. A sleek black sedan rolled to a smooth stop at the intersection. The car, a top-of-the-line luxury vehicle, gleamed under the amber streetlights, its polished surface reflecting the stillness of the night. Inside sat 38-year-old Kayla Anderson, her hands resting lightly on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. Her posture was poised, elegant, matching the tailored charcoal suit she wore, a testament to her professionalism. Her sharp heels clicked gently against the floor mat as she adjusted her position, her mind still buzzing with the aftermath of the day's meetings. As the chief financial officer of Quantum Dynamics, a Fortune 500 tech company, Kayla's days were consumed with high-stakes decisions. That evening, she had just concluded a marathon of back-to-back meetings, finalizing projections for the upcoming quarter, dealing with investors, and strategizing for the company's aggressive expansion. Her mind was still in overdrive, running through the final numbers of the day as if she was conducting an invisible orchestra of finances, balancing risks and rewards, costs and revenues. She had navigated through countless contracts and spreadsheets, her thoughts dancing between the cold, hard facts of the present and the ambitious dreams of the future. But as she sat there, the red glow of the traffic light reflecting off the hood of her car, a new sound broke through her mental forums. Kayla blinked, her brow furrowing slightly as the familiar wail of police sirens drew closer. It wasn't something she had time to think about. There were always sirens in the city, but within seconds, the red and blue lights flickered in her rearview mirror, lighting up the interior of her car in an ominous, strobe-like pattern. Her eyes caught the swirling lights, and instinctively, her body tensed. At first, she thought the cruiser might speed past her, on its way to some other urgent matter in the city. But the car didn't move ahead. Instead, it stayed behind her, signaling for her to pull over. Confusion spread through her like a slow-moving fog. She knew she hadn't been speeding. Her blinker had been used appropriately when she changed lanes earlier, and there had been nothing erratic about her driving. No reason at all to warrant being pulled over. Kayla's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel as she glanced at the speedometer, reassuring herself that she had done nothing wrong. For a moment, she considered the possibility of it being a mistake. Maybe the officer was looking for someone else, and her car had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But as the cruiser stayed close, she realized this wasn't a mistake. They were pulling her over. A familiar knot began to form in her stomach, one that she had felt before. It was that unsettling feeling, the one she could never quite shake, no matter how successful she became, no matter how much she achieved. The reality of being a black woman behind the wheel of an expensive car in America was one she knew all too well. It was a weight she had carried her entire life, a weight that followed her even as she climbed the corporate ladder, even as she shattered glass ceilings and redefined what success looked like. That weight was always there, lurking in the background, reminding her that there were spaces where she was still seen as an outsider, a stranger in her own success. She let out a long, slow breath, willing herself to remain calm. There was no reason to panic. She had done nothing wrong. The cruiser's lights continued to flash in her rearview mirror as Kayla signaled and slowly pulled her car to the side of the road. Her heart beat a little faster, but her mind remained clear. She had dealt with situations like this before. She knew the script, knew the rules of engagement. Keep your hands visible, be polite, don't give them any reason to escalate. She shifted the car into park, her hands steady as she adjusted her position in the seat. She glanced into the rearview mirror again, watching as the police cruiser came to a stop behind her. The sirens silenced, but the lights continued their disorienting dance across the quiet street. The officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, stepped out of his vehicle. His dark uniform blended into the night, but his presence was commanding, his movements deliberate. He wore dark aviator sunglasses. Even though the sun had long since set, and his hand rested casually near his holster as he approached her car. There was a stiffness to his gait, an air of authority, perhaps even hostility, that was impossible to ignore. Kayla watched him approach, her pulse quickening despite her efforts to remain composed. She didn't recognize him, but then again, why would she? Officers like him, men like him, had always been part of the landscape. They were the gatekeepers of spaces she wasn't supposed to occupy. He reached her window, his face unreadable behind those dark lenses. Kayla's fingers hovered over the button to lower her window. She pressed it, and the glass slid down with a quiet hum, exposing the calm, cool air of the evening. The silence between them was heavy, almost suffocating. "License and registration?" the officer barked, his voice clipped and cold. Kayla nodded, her movements deliberate and controlled as she reached for her documents. She knew the drill. Every action needed to be careful, measured. Any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. Her fingers brushed against the soft leather of her purse as she retrieved her wallet, pulling out her driver's license and registration. "Here you go, officer," she said, her voice even, though she could feel the tension tightening in her chest. The officer took the documents from her, barely glancing at them before his gaze shifted back to her. Even behind the sunglasses, Kayla could feel his eyes on her, studying her, judging her. His lips curled slightly, a sneer that was almost imperceptible but unmistakable. "What's the problem, officer?" she asked, her tone calm, betraying none of the storm brewing inside her. He didn't answer right away, instead looking her over one more time before muttering, "We'll see." With that, he turned on his heel and walked back to his cruiser, leaving Kayla sitting there, her thoughts racing. Something about this felt off. It wasn't just another traffic stop. There was something else going on, something beneath the surface that she couldn't quite put her finger on. She exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. It never was. The silence in Kayla's car was oppressive, punctuated only by the faint hum of the engine and the distant murmur of the city. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruiser still swirled in her rearview mirror, casting sharp, disorienting shadows on the interior of the car. Kayla shifted slightly in her seat, glancing at the clock on her dashboard. Minutes felt like hours as she sat there, waiting. She had been through this before. Too many times, in fact. The scenarios always played out the same, a familiar dance of power and perception. Kayla, with her immaculate appearance and quiet professionalism, still found herself under the same scrutinizing gaze she had known since she was a child. A gaze that questioned, doubted, and often feared her existence in spaces she had every right to be in. It was infuriating in a way that words couldn't quite capture. Here she was, one of the most powerful women in the room when it came to board meetings and corporate negotiations, reduced in this moment to just another suspect. Her title, her wealth, her accomplishments, none of it shielded her from the reality that came with simply being herself. As she waited for the officer to return, Kayla's mind raced, spinning through worst-case scenarios and memories of encounters that had gone horribly wrong for others who looked like her. She remembered watching the news, seeing faces of men and women who had been pulled over, detained, or worse for reasons just as flimsy. Their lives had been reduced to headlines, their families left to pick up the pieces. She couldn't help but think about the last time she'd been pulled over. It had been nearly a year ago, on a similar quiet evening. The officer back then had been polite enough, but the tension had been there too, a palpable unease that threaded through every exchange. It was the same every time, the questions, the doubts, the assumptions. Her car, her clothes, her very presence in certain neighborhoods seemed to invite suspicion. A quick glance in her rearview mirror showed the officer still sitting in his cruiser, his silhouette barely visible through the tinted windshield. What was taking him so long? She had been meticulous with her driving. Her speed hadn't exceeded the limit, her signals had been used correctly, and her car was in perfect working order. There was no reason for this stop, at least, no legitimate reason. Kayla's fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel, a nervous habit she had developed during long negotiations. Her mind flickered back to work, to the spreadsheets and projections waiting for her on her laptop back at home. She had planned on reviewing the numbers again tonight, ensuring that the proposed merger would be as lucrative as her team had predicted. Quantum dynamics was in the middle of a critical period, and every minute she wasted here felt like another minute stolen from the empire she had worked so hard to build. Yet here she was, sitting on the side of the road, waiting. The knot in her stomach tightened. She hated waiting. Waiting meant relinquishing control, and Kayla Anderson didn't do that easily. In the rearview mirror, the silhouette of the officer shifted, the light from the screen in his cruiser reflecting off his face. He was running her information. But how long did that take? She had no priors, no unpaid tickets, nothing that would raise a red flag. The car was registered in her name, and her license was valid. But she knew all too well that sometimes it wasn't about what was on paper. In the cruiser, Officer Ryan Grady sat, staring at the screen in front of him. He was quiet, methodical as he typed in her details, his fingers moving mechanically over the keyboard. Her name, Kayla Anderson, flashed across the system. A simple search showed everything was in order. Her license was valid, her car registered, her record spotless. Still, something about this stop felt off to Grady. His instincts had been honed over years of patrolling these streets, and those instincts had told him to pull her over. But now, sitting here in the glow of his dashboard lights, he wasn't sure what had prompted him to hit the sirens. Maybe it had been the expensive car gliding effortlessly through the intersection. Or maybe it had been the fact that it was late, and she seemed a little out of place driving through this neighborhood. This was an affluent area, clean, quiet, the kind of neighborhood where people lived behind gated communities, their driveways lined with expensive cars and immaculate lawns. People here didn't usually cause trouble, but to Grady, people like Kayla didn't usually drive here either. The black sedan, sleek and polished, had caught his eye. In his experience, there was often more to the story when someone like her was behind the wheel of a car like that. He frowned, running a hand over his jawline, feeling the rough stubble. There was something about this that didn't sit right, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe he had made a mistake, maybe his instincts had been wrong, but that wasn't a thought he liked to entertain. He had built a career on trusting his gut, and his gut had never failed him before. Grady glanced down at the documents she had handed him. Kayla Anderson, CFO, Quantum Dynamics. The title stared back at him in bold print, gold lettering embossed on the ID badge she had carelessly left on the passenger seat. He had noticed it as he had walked up to her car, the letters catching the light, throwing him off for a moment. He knew the company. Everyone in the city did. They were one of the biggest tech firms in the country, cutting-edge innovators in everything from AI to data security. His lips pursed as he leaned back in his seat, eyes flicking between the ID and the system on his screen. He had pulled her over on instinct, but now, with her record spotless and her position clearly established, that instinct felt misplaced. He wasn't used to this. Most of the people he pulled over in this area didn't have prestigious job titles or impeccable records. They usually had excuses, reasons for the stop, some plausible mistake that justified the interaction. But there was nothing here, nothing except his own assumptions. He didn't want to admit it, but there was no way around it. He had pulled her over because she didn't fit the image in his head of who should be driving through this part of town at this hour. Grady clenched his jaw, glancing out the window at Kayla's car. She was still sitting there, waiting. He could see her through the windshield, calm and composed, but he knew she was wondering why this was taking so long. For a brief moment, he thought about just letting her go, handing back her documents, offering some vague excuse, and moving on. But there was a small part of him, a stubborn, prideful part, that resisted the idea. He didn't like admitting when he was wrong, especially not in situations like this. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a misstep. Grady sighed heavily, typing a few final notes into the system before stepping out of the cruiser once more. The evening air was cooler now, a slight breeze rustling through the trees that lined the street. As he approached Kayla's window, his eyes flicked again to the ID badge on the seat beside her. Quantum Dynamics, Chief Financial Officer. He had been wrong. And he hated that. Kayla's eyes tracked him as he approached. There was a subtle shift in his posture. one she couldn't quite place. He no longer walked with the same authority, the same swagger he had carried earlier. Instead, there was something else. A hesitation, a discomfort. When he reached her window, he leaned in slightly, his eyes catching the glint of her ID badge once more. "So," he began, his voice a little softer now, "you work in finance?" Kayla nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering as she met his eyes. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. "For quantum dynamics?" he continued, his tone uncertain, as though he was struggling to reconcile the image in front of him with the assumptions he had carried with him when he first pulled her over. "That's right," Kayla answered, her tone calm but firm. "I'm the chief financial officer." For a moment, there was silence. The officer's face shifted, his bravado faltering slightly as he processed this new information. He had expected someone different, someone who fit into a more convenient narrative. But now, standing there with her title staring him in the face, he was forced to confront the reality that he had been wrong. As Officer Grady stood by Kayla's window, a strange silence enveloped the street. The usual ambient sounds of the city, cars passing, distant chatter, and the hum of everyday life, seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the rhythmic thudding of his own heartbeat in his ears. For a man who had spent decades in law enforcement, navigating countless stops and interactions, this moment felt unfamiliar. The power dynamic he had always relied on was unraveling before his eyes. "CFO, huh?" Grady muttered, almost to himself, as if the words would somehow help him make sense of the situation. His voice, once sharp with authority, now sounded almost flat, devoid of the confidence he usually carried. Kayla, her hands still resting calmly on the steering wheel, watched him closely. She wasn't new to this. She had seen it before, the subtle shift in demeanor once people realized who she was, or rather who they had assumed she wasn't. It never failed to amaze her how quickly people's attitudes could change when confronted with titles, status, or power. But the reality was, Kayla didn't care for this kind of recognition. Not here, not now. She wasn't seeking validation. What she wanted was justice, fairness, a world where she didn't have to flash a title to be treated with dignity. "Yes, officer. Is there a problem with that?" she asked, her voice cutting through the thick air between them. It wasn't aggressive, but there was a quiet strength behind her words, a strength that came from years of having to prove herself, over and over again. Grady shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at his cruiser, as if it might offer him some escape from the conversation. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile the assumptions he had made with the reality in front of him. He had pulled Kayla over with the expectation of finding something, anything, that would justify his actions. But there was nothing. No reason to stop her. No excuse to keep her here. He had always trusted his instincts, his ability to sense when something was off. But now those instincts were betraying him, exposing a deeper truth that he wasn't ready to confront. His gut hadn't led him here because of anything she had done. It had led him here because of who she was, or more specifically, who he had assumed she was. There was a tightening in his chest. A discomfort went beyond the physical. He wasn't used to this feeling, this sense of vulnerability that came with realizing he had been wrong. He had been wrong before, of course, but never like this. Never so blatantly, so obviously. And now, standing in front of a woman who was clearly in control of herself and the situation, he felt the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. No problem," Grady stammered, his voice lacking the usual force. He shifted his stance, feeling the tension in his shoulders, the stiffness in his jaw. The words felt hollow, as if he were merely playing out a script he didn't believe in. Just a routine stop." Kayla raised an eyebrow, her expression steady, though her patience was beginning to wear thin. She had seen the officer's bravado crack, watched as his confidence wavered, but that didn't change the fact that she was still sitting here, detained for no valid reason. This was her life, constantly having to push back against the implicit biases and assumptions that followed her like a shadow. "A routine stop for what exactly?" she asked, her tone sharp but controlled, like a lawyer cross-examining a witness. She wasn't raising her voice, but the precision of her words carried weight. "I wasn't speeding. I wasn't driving erratically. So, I'm curious, what was your reason for pulling me over?" Grady blinked, caught off guard by her question. He had been trained for moments like these, moments where drivers would challenge him or demand explanations. Usually he had a reason, even if it was flimsy. But this time there was no justification, no technicality he could fall back on. His mind raced, searching for an answer that would hold up, but nothing came. The seconds stretched on, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing moment. Kayla didn't look away. She wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles to let this moment slip away without demanding accountability. Grady hesitated, fumbling for words. His mind landed on the vaguest excuse he could muster, the one that had been used 1,000 times in situations like these. You matched a description, he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew how weak they sounded. Kayla's eyes narrowed. A description of what? She asked, her tone calm but cutting. Grady froze. He had nothing. There was no description, no bulletin, no report that could justify what he had done. It was just him and his assumptions, laid bare for both of them to see. His silence was deafening. For a man who had always prided himself on maintaining control, on asserting authority in every interaction, this moment felt like a complete unraveling. He had nothing to say, because there was nothing to say. He had pulled her over because, in his mind, she didn't fit the image of someone who should be driving through this neighborhood in a car like that. That was the ugly truth, and it hung between them like a weight, heavy and undeniable. Kayla exhaled slowly, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't surprised by his answer, or rather, his lack of one. This was the reality she had lived her entire life. She had always known that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she achieved, there would always be moments like this, where her very presence was questioned, her success deemed suspicious. But she wasn't here to let him off easily. Not tonight, officer, she began, her voice steady but firm. Assumptions like the one you made tonight are dangerous. They can change lives, end lives. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't breaking any laws. So, what exactly gave you the impression that I matched a description? Grady's face flushed. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. Most people he pulled over didn't push back. They accepted the situation and moved on, even when it wasn't fair. But here she was, holding him accountable, in a way that felt deeply uncomfortable. And the worst part was, he knew she was right. His hand twitched slightly at his side, his mind still searching for a way out of the situation. But there was no escape. He was trapped by his own actions, his own biases. He stammered again, his voice faltering. I might have made an assumption. Kayla's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes locking onto his. Assumptions are dangerous, officer, she repeated, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience. You hold a lot of power in this situation. A routine stop might be just another part of your day, but for people like me, it's not routine. It's life or death. Grady swallowed hard, the truth of her words sinking in like stones. He had never really thought about it that way. To him, stops like these were routine. He didn't consider the fear, the anxiety, or the weight of being on the other side of that interaction. But now, standing here in front of Kayla, he could feel it. The tension in the air, the unspoken fear that came with being pulled over for no reason other than fitting a narrative that had no basis in reality. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing away for a moment before meeting her gaze again. I'm sorry, he said, the words catching in his throat. It wasn't a word he used often, especially not in uniform, but he knew he owed her at least that much. I made an assumption I shouldn't have. Kayla didn't flinch. She had heard apologies before, hollow words spoken without real reflection. But this time there was something different. The officer's demeanor had shifted entirely. He wasn't standing here as an enforcer of the law anymore. He was standing here as a man who had been forced to confront something uncomfortable within himself. I'm not looking for an apology, she said quietly, her voice soft but resolute. I just want you to understand the impact of what you did tonight. Grady nodded, though the gesture felt heavy with guilt. His usual bravado, the authority he had always wielded, had been stripped away, leaving him exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had walked into the situation expecting control, but now he was the one being taught a lesson. The cracks in his armor were showing, and he knew there was no way to cover them up. The air between them felt thick, as if the very atmosphere was straining under the weight of the unspoken truths that lingered between them. For what seemed like an eternity, neither Kayla nor Officer Grady spoke. The tension wasn't just about the flashing lights or the authority Grady had once exuded. It was something deeper, something far more uncomfortable. Kayla kept her gaze steady, refusing to let the silence diminish the gravity of the moment. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let a man like Grady walk away without understanding the magnitude of what had just transpired. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a microcosm of the daily indignities she and people like her endured. The frustration gnawed at her, though she fought to maintain her composure. She had learned long ago that even in moments like this, when she had every right to be angry, she couldn't afford to let her emotions betray her. Grady, on the other hand, was lost in a fog of his own confusion. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned like this, especially by someone who wasn't cowering under his badge or placating his authority. The cool confidence Kayla exuded had completely disarmed him, leaving him exposed and unsure of himself in a way he hadn't felt in years. He stood there, awkwardly shifting from one foot to the other, his mind a swirl of shame and discomfort. The truth had never been clearer to him than it was in that moment. He had overstepped. He had acted not on reason or necessity, but on a deeply ingrained bias that had driven so many of his decisions without him even realizing it. He had never truly questioned why he pulled certain people over more than others, or why certain neighborhoods seemed to require more stops. Until now, those actions had been automatic, reflexive. And yet here in front of him was living proof that those reflexes had failed him. Kayla could feel the weight of his silence, and she wasn't going to let him off that easily. "You can't just walk away from this," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. She wasn't shouting. There was no need to. The power of her words came from their precision, their clarity, and the undeniable truth they carried. "You need to understand that what you did tonight isn't just about me. It's about everyone who looks like me, everyone who gets stopped for no reason other than the color of their skin. You're a part of a system that keeps us under constant suspicion, and that has consequences." Her words cut through the night like a blade, slicing through the fragile silence. Grady blinked, the reality of what she was saying hitting him harder than he expected. He had heard these conversations before, of course, on the news, in his department, during the endless diversity training sessions that always seemed to go in one ear and out the other. But hearing it now from her felt different. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was real, raw, and deeply personal. He cleared his throat, fumbling for words that didn't come. His mind raced, but every explanation, every excuse he had rehearsed in his head fell apart under the scrutiny of her gaze. He had nothing to offer her that could undo the harm, no words that would suddenly make this right. Kayla let out a small sigh, her grip on the steering wheel loosening just slightly. She wasn't surprised by his silence. She had seen it too many times before. Men like Grady rarely had anything to say when faced with the truth. But that didn't make this any easier. She wasn't interested in humiliating him, but she also wasn't going to let him walk away without realizing that his actions mattered. "Officer," she continued, her voice softer now, "you're in a position of power. You can't afford to make these kinds of mistakes. Your assumptions could have escalated the situation in a way that could have ended very differently. And that's something I need you to understand." Grady swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He shifted on his feet again, glancing down at the documents still clutched in his hand. The once cool, controlled cop was now a man who felt as though the very ground he stood on was crumbling beneath him. He had spent years building a career, one that had taught him to rely on his instincts, to trust his gut. But now he was faced with the uncomfortable truth that his gut wasn't infallible, that his instincts, honed through years of patrolling, weren't always right. He cleared his throat again, struggling to form the words. "Look, I'm sorry if I made you feel like you didn't belong here," he said, his voice low, almost as if he were afraid of admitting it. "That wasn't my intention." Kayla arched an eyebrow, her lips forming a tight line. The apology was weak, half-formed, but she could hear the discomfort in his voice. She could see it in the way his hands fidgeted, the way he avoided her gaze, He wasn't used to apologizing. And certainly not to people like her. "That's the problem, officer," she said quietly, her eyes steady on his. "It's never the intention, but the impact is real. The consequences are real. You didn't intend to make me feel unwelcome, but that's exactly what you did. And the next time you pull someone over because they match a description, I hope you remember that." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Grady felt as if the world had stopped. It was as if everything he had believed in, everything he had built his identity around, was being dismantled piece by piece. He had always prided himself on being a fair cop, someone who enforced the law with integrity. But tonight, he realized that fairness wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about recognizing the biases that colored how those rules were applied. Grady finally met her gaze, the full weight of his mistake sinking in. He had overstepped, but more than that, he had contributed to a system that routinely dehumanized people like her. The badge on his chest, the authority it represented, suddenly felt heavier than it had ever felt before. I'll think about what you've said," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't an empty promise. He wasn't saying it to placate her or to diffuse the situation. He meant it. For the first time in years, he felt the need to truly reflect on his actions, to confront the uncomfortable truths he had been avoiding for so long. Kayla nodded, though her expression remained unreadable. She had heard similar promises before, but something about the way Grady said it, something about the brokenness in his voice, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, he was serious. Still, she wasn't here to change him. She wasn't here to be his teacher. Her only job tonight had been to survive this encounter and ensure that it didn't spiral out of control. "That's a start," she said softly, her tone a bit more neutral now. "But understanding isn't enough. What you do with that understanding matters." Grady nodded, the weight of her words sinking in as he stood there, feeling more like a student than an officer. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to be taught a lesson, to be called out so clearly on his biases. But now, standing in the fading evening light, with the sound of distant traffic and the quiet hum of the city around them, he realized that this was exactly what he needed. Kayla glanced back at the dashboard. It had only been a few minutes since the stop, but it felt like a lifetime. She had said what she needed to say. She had fought this battle for too long, and tonight was just another chapter in the endless story of proving her worth, of asserting her humanity in a world that often denied it. "Good night, officer," she said quietly, her hands returning to the wheel as she prepared to drive away. Grady handed her documents back to her, his fingers brushing against the smooth leather of the folder that held her registration. "Good night, Miss Anderson," he replied, his voice still carrying the weight of everything that had been said. Kayla started the engine, the quiet purr of the car breaking the silence. Without another word, she pulled away from the curb, her headlights cutting through the darkness as she disappeared into the night. Officer Grady stood there for a long moment, watching the taillights of her car fade into the distance. The street felt quieter than it had before, almost as if the world was giving him space to reflect. His chest felt tight, not from anger or frustration, but from a sense of realization that he had never felt before. He turned back to his cruiser, but before he could get in, he glanced down at his badge, the metal catching the faint glow of the streetlights. It felt different now, as if the weight of it had doubled. The authority it gave him, the power it represented, it had always felt like a shield, something that set him apart. But tonight, that shield had cracked, and what lay underneath was something he wasn't ready to face. As he sat in his cruiser, staring at the darkened road ahead, Grady knew that this moment would stay with him. This wasn't just a routine stop, it was a wake-up call. And while the road ahead wasn't clear, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go back to the way things were. Kayla's words echoed in his mind as he drove away, his headlights casting long shadows on the empty streets. What you do with that understanding matters. The question was, what would he do now? The black sedan glided effortlessly down the road, its taillights growing fainter as Kayla Anderson left the scene behind her. Yet, even as the city blurred past her, her mind stayed locked in the moment that had just transpired. She could still feel the tension in her muscles, the tightness in her chest slowly unwinding, though not fully gone. It never fully went away, no matter how many times she had these encounters. Her hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, her knuckles whitening against the leather. She wasn't angry, not in the explosive way she sometimes wished she could be. Instead, she was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, even physically. It was the kind of weariness that came from carrying the weight of proving herself again and again, day after day. She had survived another encounter, but surviving was never the point. Change was. As Kayla drove deeper into the city, the streets seemed to grow busier, but inside her car it was as if she had entered a bubble where time stood still. The glow of streetlights and the soft hum of passing cars were distant, muted. Her thoughts were far from the numbers and projections that had once consumed her mind. Instead, they were on the conversation she had just had, the tension that had filled the air, and the subtle shift in Officer Grady's demeanor when he realized who she was, who he had assumed she wasn't. She thought about his face as he handed back her documents. There had been something in his eyes, an uncertainty, a hesitation that she hadn't expected. For a moment, she had felt the power of her words sink into him, as if they had pierced through the shield of authority he wore so easily. But would it last? Would he truly reflect on what had happened tonight, or would he fall back into the same patterns, the same biases, the same assumptions that had brought them to this moment in the first place? Kayla let out a slow breath as she reached a familiar turn. She was almost home, but her mind was far from resting. Change didn't happen overnight. She knew that. She had spent her entire career fighting for change, in the boardroom, in corporate spaces, where she was often the only black woman at the table, and in moments like these, where she was forced to confront the everyday biases that followed her like a shadow. But still, tonight had been different. There had been a crack in the armor. She had seen it. And while she didn't expect Officer Grady to suddenly transform into a champion of justice, there was a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her words had planted a seed. Maybe the next time he pulled someone over, he would hesitate before acting on his assumptions. Kayla pulled into her driveway, the familiar comfort of her home coming into view. The house was large but understated, its modern architecture blending seamlessly into the quiet neighborhood. She parked her car and sat there for a moment, letting the engine hum beneath her before finally shutting it off. For a long moment, she just sat in silence, the weight of the evening settling over her like a heavy blanket. It wasn't over. It was never over. But she had done her part tonight. She had spoken truth to power. She had made him think. That had to count for something. Meanwhile, miles away, Officer Grady sat in his cruiser, parked in an empty lot. The flashing lights that had once illuminated his night were off, and the radio, usually buzzing with dispatch calls, was silent. He hadn't driven home yet. He couldn't. His mind was too restless, too full of thoughts that he couldn't shake. The night had grown darker, the city quieter, but inside his head it was loud, too loud. Kayla Anderson's words echoed in his mind, replaying over and over again, each one cutting deeper than the last. You didn't intend to make me feel unwelcome, but that's exactly what you did. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of years, maybe even generations, of people like her having to explain themselves, justify their presence, prove their innocence. Grady had been in law enforcement for over 2 decades, and in all that time, he had never questioned his actions like this. He had never stopped to think about how his assumptions, his split-second decisions, might be shaped by something deeper, something he didn't want to admit was there. He clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the steering wheel. What did this mean? That he was a bad cop? A bad person? Grady had always thought of himself as a man who followed the rules, who enforced the law fairly. But tonight, that illusion had cracked, and now he was left staring at the pieces, unsure of how to put them back together. Kayla Anderson wasn't like the others he had pulled over. She had power, status. Her words carried weight in a way that most people's didn't. But that was exactly the problem, wasn't it? What if she hadn't been a CFO? What if she hadn't had that gold-embossed badge on the passenger seat? Would he have treated her the same if she had been just another person passing through without the prestige to challenge him? His gut churned at the thought. He wanted to believe that he would have done the right thing, but tonight had shown him something ugly, something he wasn't ready to confront. Grady leaned back in his seat, staring up at the darkened sky through the windshield. The stars were hidden behind the city lights, but he wasn't really looking at them anyway. His thoughts were somewhere else, back on the street where he had stood, staring at Kayla's calm, unflinching gaze. "You're part of a system that keeps us under constant suspicion." She was right. He knew it, even if he didn't want to admit it. He had been part of that system for years, enforcing laws that often seemed to serve only certain people. But what was he supposed to do now? How could he change something so deeply ingrained in himself, in the very system he had sworn to uphold? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about him. It was about the uniform he wore, the badge he carried, the power that came with it. And for the first time in his career, he wondered if he had been wielding that power in a way that caused more harm than good. His chest felt tight. He didn't know where to go from here. He couldn't just walk into the precinct tomorrow and announce that he had seen the light, that he was going to be different. It wasn't that simple. But he also couldn't go back to the way things were. Not after tonight. Not after looking into Kayla Anderson's eyes and seeing the quiet exhaustion of someone who had been through this too many times before. Grady let out a long breath, his hand reaching up to rub the back of his neck. He didn't know what to do. But he knew that he couldn't ignore this feeling. He couldn't pretend that tonight hadn't changed something in him. For now, that was all he had, a gnawing sense of responsibility, a realization that the badge on his chest carried more weight than he had ever understood. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start. As Kayla sat in her quiet living room, the city lights casting a soft glow through the windows, she sipped her tea and let herself unwind. The tension in her shoulders was finally starting to fade, though the events of the night still lingered at the edges of her mind. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, a text from a colleague about tomorrow's meetings. Kayla smiled faintly, her fingers hovering over the screen before setting it aside. The corporate world would still be there tomorrow, full of challenges and obstacles she would overcome, just like she always had. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of peace. She had done her part, she had spoken her truth. And as she closed her eyes, a quiet hope flickered in her heart, a hope that maybe, in some small way, she had helped shift the world just a little bit closer to justice.